In this episode of Trifles, we go for a stroll with Holmes and Watson throughout the streets of London, investigating exactly what was up with their pre-dinner, after dinner, or whatever time they took their strolls. Was this for exercise? Was it for fresh air? A look across the canon on rambling through London and elsewhere. Support for this episode of Trifles is brought to you by the Baker Street Journal, the leading publication of Sherlockian scholarship since 1946. Find them online at bakerstreetirregulars.com. And also by the generous support of listeners like you, who choose to support us at Patreon for as little as $1 a month. Patreon.com/trifles.
Welcome to Trifles, a weekly podcast about the Sherlock Holmes stories.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Yes, there were 3 gables, 5 orange pips, and a sign of 4, but there are hundreds of other details to pick apart in the stories.
Pray, be precise as to details.
You know the plots, but what about the minutiae? Have you ever stopped to wonder about how much money Holmes actually collected from the Duke of Holderness? Or why Watson constantly had to read the telegrams to him?
You are very inquisitive, Mr. Holmes.
It is my business to know what other people don't know.
Scott Monty and Burt Wolder will have the answers to these questions and more in Trifles.
The game's afoot.
Episode 309, Rambling About. Well, hi there, and welcome to Trifles, the Sherlock Holmes podcast where we like to poke around a bit and find some of the minutiae in the canon. I'm one of your hosts, Scott Monty.
And I'm bruised. I'm Burt Wolder.
Oh, I hate to hear you bruised. Is it just your ego, or is it your physical corporeal corpus?
Thing. It's because you're poking around. I wish you'd just cut that out.
Well, how else am I going to see if you're awake?
Put that stick down, for crying out loud, Monty. This is the 21st century.
Oh, Bert, you have 10-foot pole marks all over you. I don't understand.
Yeah, well, Elliot Ness tells me I should be untouchable.
Well, unfortunately, this is audio only, so hopefully it's not unlistenable. This is Trifles. As I said, we look at some of the items that come across our attention in the Sherlock Holmes stories. Maybe it's something you've thought about before. Maybe it's something that you've completely missed, and it is our responsibility to point it out to you. This episode is going to look at some walkabouts in the canon. You can find the show notes at ihost.co/trifles309, all lowercase ihost.co/trifles309. That'll take you to the SherlockHolmesPodcast.com website where you can find any links, any other information related to our episode here, and the ability to sign up for email updates and to support us on Patreon. Our patrons not only get advertising-free versions of the show, but they also have an opportunity to get additional bonus content from time to time when we are in good spirits. So check that out. See about becoming a supporter of Trifles, helping us keep this show going. We have another month to go before we enter our 7th season here. We're very excited about that. And hopefully your support can help us see our way to creating more topics that are worthy of consideration. Well, rambling about, we do tend to ramble a bit ourselves in this show. Yeah. Do you realize, Bert, that when we started, this was supposed to be a 15-minute show every week? And
I think our intro and our outro are 15 minutes.
Practically. We have, what? We think so highly of our listeners that we have doubled our output. Isn't that something?
Yes.
Wow.
Yes, it's absolutely. Yeah.
Double your pleasure or your pain in this case. Well, in this instance, I was taken by a quote that I came across, and it's kind of a familiar opening. When we encounter some of the Sherlock Holmes short stories, the opening is that classic Baker Street scene. But there are a few instances where Holmes and Watson are out and about, and they come back to Baker Street only to find a client waiting for them, or a client having called upon them when they were out doing other things. And in these instances, I found kind of a common thread that Holmes and Watson were out taking a stroll. And I thought that, how interesting. And it's not clear whether it's an after-dinner stroll or what, but I want to explore that together with you and see what we can make of it. I don't know if there's any comprehensive conclusion here, but let's explore Holmes and Watson's walkabouts. Now,
it's a wonderful subject. It really is, because for a couple of reasons. One is, if you think about it, if our listeners think about it, please, listener, think about this.
Please think.
It's one of those wonderful human touches. Think of all of the other detectives in the late 19th century, early 20th century, any kind of detective you read about. But here is a detective and his only friend who, for the course of the career, over 40 years in the 60 cases, this is sort of a recurring theme. Occasionally, they just go on a long walk, and it's another one of these touches of humanity, these touches of reality, where Watson has an opportunity to participate in a stroll and have a general conversation and tell us generally about what he and Holmes talked about. And so it's another touch of a reality that makes the characters stand out and be so, and create the illusion, that they, as we know, that they really existed.
Yeah, and I think, you and I, we both enjoy walking, whether it's on a treadmill or out in nature. This is just part of life. And there's a wonderful saying or phrase called solvitur ambulando, which is Latin for "it is solved by walking."
And, I like that.
Yeah, so many times in life we get to a point where we're frustrated by something. Maybe we have a creative block or a writer's block, or something is simply weighing on our conscience. And getting out of the house, getting away from the desk, getting away from the problem at hand, and simply taking a walk in nature or in our surroundings. Maybe it's urban, maybe it's rural. It does wonders for the mind and the soul. It's almost a meditative kind of process. You're physically moving, you're looking about, you're observing, but at the same time, the mind is at ease. And this is interesting that we find Holmes and Watson in a similar kind of circumstance in a number of cases.
Well, it's interesting, too. Many of the authors that we've interviewed on iHose and other authors, but I remember Nancy Springer telling us once, the author of the Enola Holmes series, that she went out for a walk one day to think about a particular assignment that she'd gotten from an editor and came back with this whole remarkable plot, sort of in her head. P.G. Wodehouse, the writer, used to take long strolls, sometimes with his dogs, to develop his own thinking about plots. And it's fundamental to Sherlock Holmes, even from the beginning. In A Study in Scarlet, when Watson is first trying to get the sense of who his new roommate is, he tells us sometimes he spent his day at the chemical laboratory and sometimes he was in dissecting rooms, but occasionally he took long walks, which appeared to take him into the lowest portions of the city. And then later on in A Study in Scarlet, when Watson is erroneously listing Holmes's characteristics, he says his knowledge of geology was practical. He tells at a glance different soils from each other. After walks, he has shown me splashes upon his trousers and told me by their color and consistence in what part of London he had received them. Isn't that amazing? Can you imagine being with someone who comes back from a walk and says, hey, come here. Take a look at this. Have you ever seen any red color like that? Oh, wait, look to see what's on the underside of my shoe. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah, I really have to wonder, was the soil that different in different areas of London? Was it really that discernible? It's a little bit of an affect there, and I could understand that Conan Doyle, coming from the tutelage of Dr. Joseph Bell at the University of Edinburgh, may have been able to discern the soil from different areas outside of the city, but within the city itself, I don't know. I'm a little skeptical there, but the point is taken.
Yeah. Well, you also have to understand that this is still, the London of horse-drawn carriages, and, the streets were not as completely, certainly not to the degree that they're paved today for automobiles and so on. I do think that there were probably more bits of earth turned up, but it's a very good question. That classic bit of you posted a letter because they're turning up the soil near the post office at Wigmore Street.
Right.
All that. Yeah.
Well, and it leads me to wonder if horse droppings would be different in different areas of the city. Right. Maybe they eat different things. The fishmongers down at the Thames feed their horses different things than those in the city. Let's explore the first example of Holmes and Watson out for a walk. I think you're setting the tone there with Holmes very specifically going out on a mission for his walks was interesting, because in that case, in A Study in Scarlet, he was building his knowledge. He was exploring rather than just rambling. And when we get to the yellow face in the memoirs of Sherlock Holmes, there's a couple of paragraphs at the beginning of the story that really set the tone here. Watson tells us, Sherlock Holmes was a man who seldom took exercise for exercise's sake. And that's important. We'll come back to that. Few men were capable of greater muscular effort, and he was undoubtedly one of the finest boxers of his weight that I've ever seen. But he looked upon aimless bodily exertion as a waste of energy, and he seldom bestirred himself where there was some professional object to be served. Then he was absolutely untiring and indefatigable. That he should have kept himself in training under such circumstances is remarkable, but his diet was usually of the sparest, and his habits were simple to the verge of austerity. Save for the occasional use of cocaine, he had no vices, and he only turned to the drug as a protest against the monotony of existence when cases were scanty and the papers uninteresting. One day in early spring, he had so far relaxed as to go for a walk with me in the park, where the first faint shoots of green were breaking out upon the elms, and the sticky spearheads of the chestnuts were just beginning to burst into their fivefold leaves. For 2 hours we rambled about together, in silence for the most part, as befits two men who know each other intimately. It was nearly 5 before we were back in Baker Street once more. Well, what do you make of that?
Wow, yeah, I think, it's just wonderful. It's another one of these great touches, these great human characteristics that a friend, any friend, might tell you about their day. Yesterday we went for long walks, and it's another indication of the great friendship between these two people that has cemented them and solidified them in our minds for so many years.
And it's interesting. Well, first of all, that they arrived back before 5 o'clock. So this was a preprandial stroll, maybe working up an appetite for one of Mrs. Hudson's dinners, rather than working off the calories that they consumed at that table around the sitting room. But at the same time, we have this wonderful phrase that Sherlock Holmes was a man who seldom took exercise for exercise's sake. So thinking back to that example you used in A Study in Scarlet, Holmes was out in the vilest alleys and strolling around London with a purpose in mind. He was studying the inhabitants, he was studying the habits, he was certainly studying the geology of the city. But for Watson to be able to convince Holmes to go for a walk with him, that really seems a little different than the Holmes that he described.
Yeah, it does. Well, it points out, too, that Watson's understanding of physical therapy, physical culture, and bodily health was probably about as good as it could have been in the 19th century, but not up to the 21st century. I don't think it's clear that anyone who seldom took exercise just for the sake of exercising could develop the muscular strength and the coordination required to be a terrific boxer. And then to suddenly be able to call on great stores of energy and be untiring and indefatigable. It is remarkable that he should have kept himself in training under such circumstances, and I think Watson might not have noticed exactly how Holmes did that.
That could very well be. He sees, but he does not observe.
Yes, I say, Holmes, have you thought about writing a book about your physical training? Because after all, you lie in bed at all times, seldom can be moved, and yet you're a fabulous boxer. Why is that?
Cocaine, Watson, cocaine.
The Holmes method of physical culture. Yeah.
Let's first listen to this method from our sponsor. The Baker Street Journal was first published in 1946, and its old series extended through 1949. It picked up again in 1951 and has been publishing ceaselessly every quarter since then. Every issue of the BSJ is packed with top-notch papers that reflect the sensibilities of Sherlockians from throughout the world. They might be scholarly in nature, giving us details on an aspect of Victorian life that maybe we weren't aware of. They might be tongue-in-cheek, that approach to the game where we wink at each other as we acknowledge Dr. Watson as the true author of the stories and try to figure out some inconsistency. Or they might be something that we never thought was related to Sherlock Holmes, and the author brings it all together for us. Whatever the approach, they're all represented in the Baker Street Journal. Plenty of varying opinions and researches on the world of Sherlock Holmes. Make sure you get on the subscription list to get your copy of the Baker Street Journal delivered to your mailbox every quarter by going to bakerstreetirregulars.com today. All right, strolling around the streets of London. There are a couple of instances here where these rambles are either inferred or simply alluded to very briefly. And the example we shared before with the yellow face was interesting because when Holmes and Watson get back, they find a pipe that had been left behind, and Holmes is able to deduce a little bit about Grant Munro. I believe that's who. Yeah, Grant Munro. Yeah. In The Yellow Face. And a similar instance occurred in the opening of The Hound of the Baskervilles, where a Penang lawyer, a walking stick, had been left behind by James Mortimer the night before. Right, so the scene opens with Holmes and Watson at breakfast, and Holmes has that famous shiny coffee pot in front of him, and shocks Watson, who thinks Holmes has eyes in the back of his head. But this stick that Watson is observing had been left behind the evening before. Now, we were not told where Holmes and Watson were when Dr. Mortimer called upon them, but it wouldn't be too much of a stretch of the imagination to consider that Holmes and Watson were out for one of their strolls.
No, not at all. And, The Hound is a great example because there are a couple of lovely little points where walking really puts a wonderful characteristic or a feel on the case and on the event. So to that point, when they're looking at the stick, we have this wonderful interchange with Holmes and Watson, where Holmes inquires as to what Watson can reason from looking at the stick. And after that happens, he says, "Oh, well, I'm afraid, most of your conclusions were erroneous, but you weren't entirely wrong in this instance. The man is certainly a country practitioner, and he walks a good deal." So Holmes deduces that from the stick. And then later on in The Hound of the Baskervilles, when they're investigating Sir Henry Baskerville's hotel, you can see that Holmes is, it's sort of an interesting reference, but he's having this sort of odd conversation with the front desk to see who else is at. If any of the people who are interested in Sir Henry might also be lodging at Sir Henry's hotel. And Holmes says, "Oh, I know that. This is the great reference, of course, to Theophilus Johnson, which is now the investiture of our friend Tim Johnson." But he gets this list of names, and Holmes says, "Surely that must be the same Johnson whom I used to know. A lawyer, isn't he? Gray-headed and walks with a limp." And then, of course, the babbling front desk person says, "Oh, no, this is the coal owner. He's a very active gentleman. He's not older than yourself." Blah, blah, blah. But it's interesting. And that happens again, that little reference, of course, in The Twisted Lip, when they're thinking about Hugh Boone, we note that he walks with a limp. And it also pops up in the case of Identity, when you have Miss Mary Sutherland, who it turns out, her experience with Hosmer Angel, "I met him twice for walks." So the people in the world of Sherlock Holmes are always on the move.
They are.
But the Resident Patient is a wonderful case for another reason, because it's the one case, I think, where Holmes is the one who suggests the walk.
Yes.
The opening of The Resident Patient has this mind reading routine that we've talked about before, where Holmes deduces what's in Watson's mind. But suddenly, Holmes says, "The evening has brought a breeze with it. What do you say to a ramble through London?"
And one has to wonder if Holmes had any purpose in this ramble. I mean, we're told earlier in the story it had been a close, rainy day in October. Our blinds were half drawn, and Holmes lay curled upon the sofa, reading and rereading a letter. Perhaps he just perhaps he had a case of cabin fever, and just simply wanted to get out and stretch his leg. And it's interesting because he in this mind reading incident, he even acknowledges that Watson's hand stole toward his old wound, and I wonder if it was Holmes kind of deducing that Watson needed a little physical therapy that day.
Oh, that's good.
The weather, the inclement weather, may have been bothering Watson's wound, and it was certainly on his mind when he glanced to the Henry Beecher Stowe portrait on the wall. And maybe it was his way of saying, "Hey, Watson, let's make sure that you get this exercise that you so need to keep up your physical well-being."
Yeah. Oh, I like that a lot. That's great.
And Watson admits, he says, "I was weary of our little sitting room and gladly acquiesced. For 3 hours we strolled about together, watching the ever-changing kaleidoscope of life as it ebbs and flows through Fleet Street and the Strand. His characteristic talk, with its keen observance of detail and subtle power of inference, held me amused and enthralled. It was 10 o'clock before we reached Baker Street again. A brougham was waiting at our door." So this was a late night stroll. This was from 7 to 10. They were out. So the weather really must have held them in and kept them cooped up for the day. And this was something of necessity.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. And speaking of necessity, Holmes does use walking as a key element in his researches. We alluded to that earlier, but another good example of that is Wisteria Lodge. Without getting too much into the story, Watson observes early on in that case, Holmes spent his days in long and often solitary walks or in chatting with a number of village gossips whose acquaintance he'd cultivated. So Holmes is doing his investigation, and Watson is disappointed that nothing is happening. Watson says, I just waited in vain. Day succeeded day, and my friend took no step forward. And he goes on these long walks. Well, eventually Holmes says, my first days in this village were devoted to a series of walks, in which, in the intervals of my botanical researches, I made a reconnaissance of all the large houses and an examination of the family history of the occupants, and one house, and only one, riveted my attention. And then he finds out that there's someone in that house named Henderson, and then Holmes notices Henderson never by any chance walks alone. His dark secretary is like his shadow.
Yeah, perfect. That is perfect. And it seems to me, if I can just, we don't have this scripted or noted in our preparation here, but either in The Devil's Foot and or The Lion's Mane, we have Holmes out taking walks. And, of course, these are two settings that are near the shore. And what better place for inspiration and bracing air than the seashore for a bit of a ramble?
Yes, it's an odd point. In Devil's Foot, which is a case that I know pretty well, this happens again. Watson, apparently there's this, not too many, you don't really realize it when you're reading the case, but there's a period of 2 days when nothing happens. And Watson underscores it. He says, the police, maybe they resented the intrusion of an amateur, or they were doing something, that was useful for the investigation, but we heard nothing from them for the next 2 days. And during this time, Holmes spent some of his time smoking and dreaming in the cottage, but a greater portion in country walks, which he undertook alone, returning after many hours without remark as to where he had been. And then, of course, what happens is, Watson then tells us he bought a lamp, the same lamp that was in the Tregennis household. And then you have the great scene where they experiment with the lamp with very dire effects. But, there's Holmes strolling around the countryside. Yeah,
and I get the sense that Holmes, in his retiring years, as he lived on the South Downs, in the Lion's Mane, he says, my villa is situated upon the southern slope. My house is lonely. I, my old housekeeper, and my bees have the estate all to ourselves. And half a mile off, however, is Harold Stackhurst's well-known coaching establishment, the Gables. He was, Holmes was out for a walk toward the end of July 1907. He said there was a severe gale, the wind blowing up channel. On the morning of which I speak, the wind had abated and all nature was newly washed and fresh. It was impossible to work on so delightful a day, and I strolled out before breakfast to enjoy the exquisite air. I walked along the cliff path which led to the steep descent to the beach, and as I walked, I heard a shout behind me. So there, Holmes just out to enjoy the morning air. How refreshing and how different from the Holmes we meet in A Study in Scarlet in his very first days with Watson, who was scouring the streets for mud and horse fertilizer and God knows what else. The air was much different on the South Downs, shall we say.
Yeah, very refreshing, very clean. Well, it's just another great example of the verisimilitude of the lives of Holmes and Watson, and why, after so many years, we still keep coming back to these cases and still enjoy the friendship and the reality of these people that we've come to know so well.
And that is just a trifle.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Please join us again next week for another installment of Trifles. Show notes are available on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and be sure to check out our longer show, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, where we interview notable Sherlockians and share news of the Sherlockian world.
You take my breath away, Mr. Holmes.
A doctor's.
A general practitioner's, I perceive.
Not been long in practice or had much to do.
Come to consult us, I fancy.
Lucky we came back.
Thank you, Mrs. Hudson. Doctor,